Guys, today we've got the brand new Kraton 6S on the bench, and we're gonna be doing some serious upgrades to it using all of this. Are these upgrade parts even gonna fit on the updated platform? I have no idea. Let's find out together. One thing upgrades always do is add additional weight, and I'm really curious to see just how close this updated power system is to being overloaded, so we're gonna leave it in to begin with, but don't worry, because that's gonna be getting upgraded too. And in case you missed my first video on this car, make sure you check it out after this one, because Arrma updated a whole lot more than they mention on their website. If you're doing a big upgrade like this, one of the best places to start, especially if you're replacing the chassis, is just to take every screw out of that chassis. And the best way I found to stay organized is just start from the front, work your way back, take your screws and line them up exactly as they came out of the chassis. As you work back, take some pictures of these screws, because inevitably you're gonna end up hitting them and knocking them out of place, so you wanna make sure you know where they go. Occasionally you might find an uncooperative screw. This one's tied to the steering, and it's actually spinning the steering post on the other side of the chassis, so we'll have to address that in just a minute. This car is pretty close to new, so most of the screws are clean, but as you can see here, this one's loaded up with some junk. This is a very common problem, especially on the underside of the chassis, and it's one of the main reasons why screws get stripped out. You wanna make sure you have a little pick, and you can clean that junk out of there. You wanna make sure these are perfectly clean before you take them out. That way you won't strip out your screws. Some of these that are screwed into aluminum are going to be thread locked in, which is why you want to make sure you're using good quality bits as well. These MIP bits are excellent and they're really long wearing. They're expensive, but they're worth it. As you progress, you're going to end up with more and more parts falling off this thing, such as this new updated side pod. Make sure you've got a clear space that isn't your workbench to store this stuff. Otherwise, it's going to get pretty crowded. Most things under here are attached to something else one way or another, so for the most part, it will all stay together though. This steel skid plate is a fantastic update from Arrma. I really appreciate this. It shows Arrma's paying attention, and this thing is pretty tough. And with that, just about every screw is out. That just leaves us with the one ornery steering post screw. Let's see what we can do about that. The post does have a hex. It's that thin little one right there. Unfortunately, I can't quite get to it without taking a bunch of stuff apart that I don't want to take apart yet. Instead, let's see if we can't release that thread lock with a little bit of heat. I found that a soldering iron right in the socket of the screw is the best way to apply concentrated heat. It'll heat up the screw without heating up everything else around it. All right, let's see if she'll come out of there now. And there we go, perfect. And now we just have 4 more screws under here. After which now we can just lift the chassis plate right off the rest of the car. The very first thing you want to do once you get the chassis plate off is to wipe all the grease off the front and the back. There's going to be a bunch of it, and if you don't get it off here, it's going to end up somewhere you don't want it. We obviously weren't able to do it here, but if you're doing a major upgrade on a new car, the best thing to do is to do it when it's brand new, because these stock parts can be worth a decent amount of money. For instance, in new condition, this chassis plate alone is worth about 40 bucks. In this condition, it's not really worth much though. That being said, we might not even be swapping this out because I don't know if the new one's going to fit. We'll find out in a little bit. You're going to want to break down the rest of this in accordance to what you're upgrading. We're going to be trying to upgrade everything, so it all needs to come apart. Fortunately, most of that's going to be relatively easy. As you can see, we've got the whole rear module here. And when you're working with parts like this, if you can, it's a really good idea just to put the screws right back where you got them from. That way you can be guaranteed to know where they came from. When you do inevitably strip out a screw like I just did, the best thing to do is to find a Torx bit that's about the same size. Make sure that the hex is very clean, because you're only going to get one chance at this. Take that Torx bit, and using a real hammer, hammer it in as far as it will go. Once you've got that in there and you applied some heat as appropriate, give it a twist, and hopefully it comes out. This one, unfortunately, I've mangled too much, and it's not going to, but fortunately, we have an alternative. I'll just take the servo horn off. Now, potentially surprisingly, we're not going to be upgrading this servo either, as this thing seems pretty stout, and I want to see what it can handle. Of course, if it does break, we've got some alternatives. We're going to kick things off with the front module, and we've got some things that should fit, some things that might fit, and some things that definitely won't fit. The new V6 has the same front bumper as the EXB V2. However, it doesn't have the same bulkhead, and this bulkhead is updated from the previous version, so I'm not sure if the upgraded A and B block system is going to work. Let's find out. I did notice it looks like they didn't quite get this gasket on right during assembly. I found this happens fairly often. Fortunately, the gaskets aren't that necessary. They're just a nice to have. Pulling the front A block off here and comparing it to the M2C 3595, they do look pretty similar. There are a few subtle differences here, but I think this will work. One interesting thing I noticed is that all 4 of the upper shock mounts are loose on this truck, and it's only got a few packs through it. So if you get one of these trucks, at the very least, it's something you want to keep an eye on, and maybe something you want to go ahead and put some thread locker on. I did take one of these off in my previous video, but I certainly didn't take all of them off. We are, however, going to take them all off this time because we do have quite a few upgrades to check out in this area. It also looks like this front arm didn't come away unscathed from the previous video. It's not broken, but this hole is elongated a little bit. That's not a huge surprise because these arms are probably the biggest weak point of this platform. And unfortunately, at least in my experience, the RPM upgrade option really isn't that much better. We've also got a nicely bent pin here, but we do have an upgrade for those at least. One thing that hasn't changed from the previous version RTRs are these upper pins. They just screw into a plastic mount in the back here. I do have an upgrade for that. Hopefully it's going to fit because this is another weak point. These do tend to back out over time. And as you can see, whereas on the rear hubs, they got rid of the little spacers, they haven't gotten rid of them up here yet. I'm looking forward to a time when we don't have these anymore. As far as I know, most people don't mess with this adjustment, though let me know down in the comments if that's something you want them to keep. These sway bar end links are also updated, though I did have one pop off in the previous video, so that problem's not completely fixed. And just like the sway bar end links, we aren't going to be upgrading anything associated with these new tie rods, so they shouldn't be a problem. One upgrade we're definitely not going to be able to use are these pillow ball retainers, and I think that's a good thing because Arrma has completely changed the design of these hubs. They're using a new pillow ball retainer design that's no longer adjustable, but also can no longer fall out of adjustment. And overall, this entire front hub is quite a bit beefier than it used to be, including having a new double shear arrangement for the steering. Obviously, that means we can't upgrade that aluminum plate, but again, it doesn't look like we're going to have to. One thing we can still upgrade are these CVDs. One of the most common screws to strip is this grub screw that holds the cross pin on this hex. I'd recommend using hand tools if you normally use power tools, and some heat if you have any problems. Also, make sure that that socket is completely cleaned out before you get started. This one came off pretty easily, and that should allow that cross pin just to pop right out of there. Sometimes they can be tight because there's some excess thread locker on them. Again, this one wasn't too bad. And an update that you guys pointed out to me is that they're using the thicker hexes. I think they're using these on all the cars now. It is nice to see they're not using those really thin ones anymore, though. We do have beefier inner bearings on these hubs, but I believe the CVDs are identical, which means we can update to these much thicker ones. And that's as simple as popping the pin out of the old one, dropping the cross pin out of it, putting the cross pin in the new one, putting the stub axle on, and putting the pin back in. Just to verify, let's make sure these are the same length, and yeah, they seem to be identical. I did notice that whereas on the V2 EXB I did have this CVD pop out of the output cup. It didn't happen on this one, and that might be due to different geometry based on this new hub. That is hard to know, and we'll have to see how it holds up long term, though. It's always a good idea to pull this grub screw all the way out and put some new thread lock on it before tightening it up. We're not going to do that here, but don't do what Donnie Don't does. Other side's going to be the same thing, so we'll quickly do that off camera. I do want to quickly mention, if you have a hard time getting that hex off, it might be a good idea to take a razor blade and just kind of scrape off all the excess thread lock, because if you don't, it's going to make the shaft harder to get out of the bearing and everything else harder to put back together. And she's all set to go. By the way, if you like keeping your hands clean, you might want to wear gloves for this step because for some reason these CVDs end up being the dirtiest part of the entire car. Next up, let's take a look at this front shock tower. I think we might run into some trouble here. It looks like the shock tower is going to work on the updated bulkhead no problem, but these body mounts are going to be a different story. Whereas the shock tower thickness itself is the same, they get a lot thicker right here where this body mount goes. I suspect M2C will be able to fix this pretty easily, but I don't have that, so let's see if we can fix it ourselves. And to do that, I'm just going to mirror this over to the other side, and I'm just going to throw a couple of screws in here temporarily just to see how much trimming we need to do. All right, we'll just mark the outline with a Sharpie, and let's take a look. So that is a decent amount of material that's going to have to be removed, but I really want to see what this is going to look like, so I'm going to go after this thing with a Dremel. I'll be right back. All right, 5 minutes on the bench grinder later, and there we go. Now, obviously, you're probably not going to have to do this, and I'm sure M2C will be updating the design very quickly, but I want to see what it's going to look like. And there we go, that's going to work just fine. The other modification we're going to have to make is to drill out one of these holes for the shock standoffs because they are larger than they used to be. We're going to be upgrading to these M2C standoffs as well, so fortunately, they come with the drill bit we'll need. I'll just drill this out off camera. Now we'll just pop in these standoffs. And this shock tower is ready to go, but we're not quite ready for it because we've got a few more things left to do on this front module. Before we dig into this differential, let's strip everything else off this bulkhead and take a look at what changed. Overall, they look fairly similar. You can see we've got a little bit of extra ribbing up here and then one extra rib here. This appears to be in an effort to better support the pinion shaft. Other than that, they look pretty similar, but it is nice to see some extra reinforcement in a potentially weak area. They've also changed the design of this upper bulkhead connection, which I'm assuming they've made stronger, but other than that, it looks pretty similar. It is nice, however, to see that they've done some work to strengthen this thing up. With the EXB V2 and now with the V6, we did get updated output cups for the differentials. These are also the 29mm EXB differentials. M2C offers an upgrade for those as well, so let's get these put in. I was planning on upgrading these differential housings to aluminum, but the aluminum ones didn't arrive in time, so we'll just pretend like this plastic is the best way to go. Obviously, if you can get aluminum housings and they're good quality, they'll probably be better than the plastic, simply because they prevent things from moving around as much. I did have a question as to whether or not these side gears are updated, and no, they look exactly the same. One thing people might not realize is not only are the external gears different on the EXP differentials, but these output cup shafts are as well. These are actually a millimeter thicker than the old BLX ones were. And we'll just pop this M2C upgrade in here and put it back together again. And stuff it right back in the bulkhead. While putting this together, I noticed there was a lot of slop on this input cup, and pulling the grub screw out, I saw there was no thread locker on it. This plastic ring is kind of supposed to act like a nylock nut, but I found it's not always effective. You might want to go in and just put a little bit of thread locker on these grub screws. Now just a few more things before we put this front module back together. We've got an updated plastic front brace here, but lining up the top screw holes with the M2C brace. We can see the bottom holes line up as well, so we can upgrade to this M2C brace. And we get a good close look at this updated servo saver. This thing's way better than the previous version. However, it still does use the old Arrma plate, so we've got an upgrade for that. I like to make sure I swap these plates out one piece at a time. It's pretty easy to get confused as to how this goes back together, and putting it together like this definitely helps. And now we just need to do the other side. Now that that's done, we just need to swap out this top plate to the thicker M2C one, and we're also going to be switching to the EXB upper arm mount. The aluminum bead lock also fits perfectly on the updated bulkhead. The last thing we need to address for these shocks, these emulsion style EXB caps are really, really good, but the M2C zero rebound system is still better. I'm not sure if the caps themselves are better, but the pistons definitely are. These pistons have O-rings in them, and they're specifically designed to slow down rebound. They're able to do that because these pistons are facing down and they have these little slots in them. Oil fills those slots during rebound and pushes the O-ring against the sidewall of the inside of the shock, and that slows down the rebound, hopefully reducing bounce on big jump landings. The stock shock pistons don't have that, so we're going to swap them out. We don't have to completely disassemble the shock in order to do that. All you need is a cross wrench. Just take that nut out of there. This is going to be a little bit messy, but it's still better than completely disassembling the shock. Once that nut's out of there, you can take the shock shaft, push it down a little bit, then push it back up, and it'll push that piston up. Take your pick, you do have a pick, right? And pull that piston out of there. Usually the washer will come out with it. That washer needs to go back in. The easiest way to do that is push the shaft all the way up, put the tip of the pick on the shaft, and the washer will fall right into place. We're gonna follow that with the piston and put the nut back on. You are going to lose a little bit of oil here. The book calls for 100 weight or 1300 CST oil. I don't have that, so we're going to go with 1000 weight. It was brought to my attention that in the previous video, I definitely did not do the ideal thing for emulsion style shocks. Emulsion style shocks should have as little air in them as possible, and there are tips and tricks to get as little air in there as possible. However, I'm not really going to worry about that, so if you're squeamish, you might want to look away now. With the shock shaft all the way out, I'm just going to put the cap on, tighten her down, pop this bleeder screw out, push the shaft all the way up, put the bleeder screw back in, and that's it. Is there too much air in here? Technically, yes. Is it going to be a problem? I don't think so. There's a lot more air in there straight from the factory, and I've done this a bunch of times, and it seems to work just fine. Again, though, this isn't the ideal way to do it. One change from the previous version is Arrma is now using these little rubber gummies for the top shock mount. They seem to work just fine, and we're going to go ahead and use those here. I'm going to go ahead and do final assembly, and then we get to feast our eyes on what is almost certainly the most upgraded front end for a V6 Kraton in the world, and man, does she look beautiful. And for the most part, everything fit on here. The only things we didn't use were the adjustable pillow ball retainers. Of course, we don't have adjustable pillow ball retainers anymore, so we couldn't use that. I didn't use these upgraded upper shock mount bushings because I think the ones that come with the new version are better. And then I didn't use this front skid plate because, again, the one that's included I think is better. I suspect this upgraded front drive shaft will work, although we're not going to know till we get this thing put back together. Speaking of which, I'm getting really excited to see how this thing bashes. For the most part, this rear module is going to be the same as the front module. There are only two things I'm concerned about. That's this tower to chassis brace and the shock tower itself. Taking a look at this tower to chassis brace, it looks like it's the same length as the updated plastic one. The updated version does use 2 screw mount holes, while the M2C one still has just 1, but I suspect this will be stronger anyway, so we will use this. And this rear shock tower has already been updated to accommodate the upgraded rear wing mount, and these new body posts use the same holes, so I think this will fit fine too. Since everything else is the same as the front, I'm just going to do this off camera. I'll let you know if I have any problems. And there we go, guys. Everything fits absolutely perfectly. I didn't have to do any modifications to anything. Even the new body mounts fit on the shock tower. Really, really excited to see if this actually fits on the chassis, but before we find that out, we need to swap out this motor mount and differential mount, and I'm certain not everything's going to fit on here. This V6 version comes with a plastic front center differential mount. We are going to upgrade that to aluminum. That should fit just fine. And this motor mount's already aluminum, but we've got an upgraded M2C one, so let's put it in. One of the smaller but probably most notable changes to the V6 platform is this use of a 16-tooth pinion. The previous version used, I think, a 12 or 13-tooth pinion, and this was considered the speed pinion, but that's what comes stock now, and I suspect the upgraded firmware on this ESC is to thank for why this motor doesn't overheat with a 16-tooth pinion on general bashing, though we do have a fan and heatsink that didn't come on the V5 version. I am going to be upgrading this fan, but I'm curious to see just how close to overheating this system was, because we're going to have a little bit of extra weight, and it might end up overheating. We'll just have to wait and see. The part of this that isn't going to work is the included top plate. That's because we have the tower-to-tower braces and the body brace. M2C does offer a version for the EXB V2, but it won't include this part of the brace, so while technically it'll work, it won't be fully functional. I'm sure they'll update it though. Okay guys, with that being done, all we have to do now is put everything back in the chassis. I was a little bit worried that this new rear skid might not clear these nuts, but it looks like it's going to fit just fine. Okay guys, so far so good. Now we just need to... And with that, we've created the world's most upgraded V6 6S Kraton, but the real question is, does the body still fit? And the answer is... yes, it does. That means the modification we made to the front shock tower worked, and everything else works on this truck. Now that we know it all works, let's go see how well it works. I just realized this thing doesn't have any carbon fiber on it. We can't have that on an Ultimate upgrade, so there we go. Now she's ready to bash. Guys, that is the perfect bashing spot, and this thing is the perfect bashing companion. There are very few cars on the market that I don't think any of the electronics need to be upgraded on. This is one of them. That being said, let's upgrade the electronics. Because I don't see any reason to permanently upgrade the electronics, I'm just going to temporarily stick my Castle Cobra 8 right here. I do want to see if this thing's more powerful than the updated firmware version of the Firma 150. It's going to be a pretty sketchy install. Let me go ahead and just get this done off camera, and I'll see you outside. Well, guys, this thing's absolutely incredible. We did finally break it. I snapped one of these rear arms. I expected to do that. That is the weak point of this platform, and there really isn't a good solution for it. Fortunately, they're pretty easy to change out. Other than that, though, everything held up great. The Castle Cobra 8 does have a little bit more pizzazz than the stock ESC, but that's not really surprising. This is an RTR ESC, and it's actually closer than I thought it would be. Overall, with the latest firmware, this firmware 150 is an absolute beast, and I don't really see any reason why you'd want to upgrade it. This motor also works really, really well. I did have some people ask me why it doesn't overheat with this 16-tooth pinion. Heat is a direct symptom of inefficiency, and the new firmware on this just seems to be more efficient, so it puts down more power while creating less heat. It still will get pretty warm, but I've never had it be too hot. The stock truck's really awesome, but these upgrades take it to the next level. I really love doing this upgrade process. I enjoyed having you with me. Why don't you join me in one of these videos?